What can you make with a lot of construction grade material? This is 2x4s by 8 feet long and some 2x6s 8 feet long. Now I really wanted to get some 1x4s, but the prices were crazy. The price of a 1x4 was $8.98, while I could get a 2x4 for $3.35. And we saw this 2x4 and get two 1x4s out for less than $2. That sounds like a good way to go. To be able to resaw this material, first I set the fence so it would cut this material directly in half. And then you notice the saw blade is very, very low. And I take multiple passes, raising this saw blade just a little bit at a time. And I want to be able to do this until I cut over halfway through this material. Once I cut over halfway, then I'm going to flip this material over and cut it through one more time to be able to split this into my two boards. And again, I'm going to lower this saw blade down so that as I flip this over, the saw blade will just barely cut through that material. And I can check the height, and that is going to be perfect. And then I can carefully run this through one last time. And this will split the two boards in half and give me the material that I need to be able to make this project. Now, anytime that you're working with a table saw, you have to be very, very careful and remember the safety rules when you're working with this machine. It can be very dangerous. If you feel uncomfortable resawing the material, then spend the extra money and buy the 1x4s by 8 feet long and save this step. After I had all the resawing done, the next step was to cut these to the width that I needed. Instead of being 3.5 inches, I want these boards 3 inches wide. Now I will say this, being that it is construction material, you are going to have some warp and twist in this wood. So I'm cutting this slightly oversized so that I can take it to the planer and the joiner. And this is a sneak peek at what I'm building. At the joiner, I need to have a reference, so I take the pencil and draw all the way down this whole entire length of the board. And then as I run this through the jointer, I'm able to see what is actually cutting and what is not cutting. Because as I said, these boards are not 100% flat. So after the first pass, you can take a look at it and you can see some areas are very nice and some areas still have a long ways to go. So therefore, I'm going to run it through one more time, and that should take care of all of the imperfections, and that pencil line should be gone. At the miter saw, I'm going to cut all of these boards to length. I have the stop block in place, so I know exactly where they need to be cut, so I can literally cut all of these at one time and only having measured once. These are the slats that I need. I need 4 sets of these, plus I need 1 set of the long ones. I also need a means to be able to hold them all together, and that's what this piece of wood will do. This will be able to screw on to the ends of each of these slats, and that will make a complete component that I'll be able to literally assemble very easily. Now, these pieces are 1 inch thick for the depth that I need, and then as far as the width, they're 1 3/8 inches wide, just a little bit less than the thickness of the uprights. I'm also rounding over all of the edges to be able to keep those sharp edges gone, because this is going to be a kid's bed and I don't need any sharp edges for them to get hurt on. So all of the slats, all of the pieces that will join these slats together, and for that matter, every piece on this bed is going to have a round over. The drill press, I'm going to pre-drill all of the holes to be able to accept these slats to be screwed together and to be able to provide the pilot hole to be able to screw it into the upright. And you'll see that in just a moment on how all of this goes together. Now these slats, remember, are 3 inches wide, and the spacer is also 3 inches wide. I'm going to start these 2 screws to be able to secure this slat, but I'm also going to put glue onto this slat. That way you'll have glue and the screws to hold it together. I'm designing this bed so that each part is a separate component. This panel will be a component that will make it where, should you have to move the bed, it'll easily be able to unscrew with just simply 4 screws, and you'll have this panel separated that would be easy to move. And I'm doing this type of design for the entire bed. In order to make sure that the slats are in the center of this little end board, I'm putting down a little spacer on the table first. And then I'm able to line these up with the mark that I have pre-marked on this board. And that way it'll give me the perfect alignment. And from a different camera angle, you can see that little spacer that I have underneath, and that brings this slat up to the center point on this board. And that makes it where it's very easy to be able to assemble. My spacer block will go right in between. You can see the pencil line to be able to have it where it lines up exactly. So this makes the process of assembling these 4 panels very, very easy. So this will complete this component. The only thing that's left is I need one long panel just like this. But these 4 are complete and they look great. And the nice thing about it, they're identical. So if you have to assemble this bed at any time in the future, any of these panels can slip to any other place. And this is the long panel that I made of the exact same design. These are the 4 2x6s by 8 foot long that I need to cut down to the length. Now this is a little bit oversized, but I want to get rid of the bulk of the waste material. Now this actually is the bed rails that will support the mattress. Of course, I'll need 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. Once I complete cutting all 4 of these, it'll be back to the jointer. I need to make sure that they're nice and flat, and that's the reason I put the pencil line on there. Once I have the board flat at the jointer, I'll take it over to the planer. I need to be able to reduce the thickness of this board from 1.5 inches down to 1 inch. Because any thicker than that is just really a waste of material for this bed. So I'll run this through several different passes, and let's take a look at the quality and what it's looking like. After the first pass, you can see the pencil line in some places. Other places it looks perfect, beautiful, nice and smooth, and there's no pencil line. And then down to this section, you see the pencil line showing up again. So this shows you just how bad, quite frankly, the construction material is, and you need to be able to make sure that you run it through the jointer several times to be able to get the entire surface completely flat. So it'll be back to the jointer. We'll run this through probably 1, maybe 2 more times until it's completely flat. I want to show you the end of this board where the jointer from the mill is still quite rough, and you can see a lot of imperfections versus the other areas where the jointer that I have in my shop cut, and it's beautiful and it's perfectly smooth. So this is a real luxury and a nice tool to have in the shop. This jointer is amazing, and you can see the imperfections in just the construction grade material. Now this is the before and after. This is how it looks after going through the jointer, and this is the construction grade material before. We'll take this over now to the thickness planer, and I'm going to cut down all of these boards so that they end up being 1 inch thick. Now this will take several passes. I'm taking small cuts at a time to be able to get this material down. There's no reason to rush. It's also important to note, you want to be able to use the jointer to get that one side perfectly flat. Now if you flipped it over and just ran that board through again, you may have a flat surface, but it's not going to be parallel to the first side. That's why you need to have the thickness planer also, because when you run it through the jointer, you have the flat surface, and that flat surface is down on the thickness planer so that you're cutting the top that hasn't been planed. That way you're going to be able to have these 2 sides parallel, and when it's finished, it's going to be a consistent 1 inch thick throughout the entire board. And that is very important, and that's quite frankly why you need both. And just to show you, I love my dust collection. It's working absolutely fantastic. Now when this is done, again because of the construction grade material, you need the Starbond medium and the thick Starbond glue to be able to stabilize these knots and fill the holes. There is going to be some significant knots and some loose knots that need to be stabilized to be able to make this work. The good thing about this, you can use this thick glue to fill in these gaps and be able to sand it down smooth, and you won't even realize there's a knot there. One thing I didn't point out to you is after I have the bottom completely flat, I do rotate this and I plane off each of the edges because I want those to be a true 90 degrees in reference to that first surface that I had cut. And here's that finished result. This looks absolutely gorgeous with no imperfections that you saw with that rough material to begin with. This, quite frankly, doesn't even need to be sanded. I love having that Cut-Tech joiner in the shop. It's time to start working on the mortise and tenon joints. Now on the uprights itself, I made this very simple little scrap wood jig to be able to put in the mortise. And this works perfect. All I need to be able to do is drop this little scrap wood jig onto the surface, align it with my reference point, clamp it down, and I'm ready to be able to cut it out. Now you also notice that little small scrap wood over there? That actually was my test piece. It's far better to be able to test on a little small scrap piece and know that everything is going to work before you do it on the real piece of wood. It just makes sense. You know the old saying, measure twice and cut once. Well, in my case, I like to be able to measure twice and then cut once on a test piece just to make sure. And then we'll take it over to the real piece of wood and cut the mortise. Now I'm using a small plunge router, and that's really all I need in my shop because quite frankly I don't use the plunge router that often, and a small one works great. I'm taking small cuts and multiple passes, lowering the depth after each time. There's no need to rush this, and I can do it very easily with multiple passes. Once the depth is set, I can just simply take this clamped off, slide it down to the next position, and that creates a perfect mortise. And then repeat that process and cut it again. Now I have to do this on all four of the uprights to be able to get these mortise exactly where they need to be and cut so that those bed rails will be able to go in there. And the next thing we'll do is cut the tenons on the bed rails. I always like to cut the mortise first, and then that way I can, if necessary, adjust the thickness of the tenon to make sure that they fit into this slot perfectly. I don't have any of the fancy equipment that some shops have that will automatically do the mortise and tenons. But this method has worked real well for me, and I can get perfect mortise and tenons cut by using this simple method. I have the depth set where it's cutting just over 3/4 of an inch. That way when I tighten these bed rails into the uprights, it's going to be tight against the shoulder. So this is going to be absolutely perfect. I can verify the depth on each one. And now let's move on and cut the matching tenons for each of these bed rails. And the first thing I did is I put the center line on here. This will be important later on when I drill the hole to receive the bolt and the nut that will go into this. But for now, I want to measure back 3/4 of an inch. That is going to be the distance of this tongue. So that's the line right there. Now on this particular router, from the edge of this bit out to this edge is 2 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to measure that now, and that will give me the point where I need to be. So it's 2 1/16, which is right there. We'll put a line, and that can be a very light line. Now I'm going to extend this out over the workbench because I want to be able to clamp this speed square right on that line right there. And that way it'll make it where my router can move freely through here. And I'm going to clamp the other end of this board. And again, making multiple passes, shallow cuts, I'll be able to cut this tenon about 1/4 of an inch down from the surface of the material. And then I'll flip it over and do the same thing to the other side. Now this, quite frankly, has to be done on all 4 sides to be able to create this tenon. You can see that leaves a perfect line there with no fuzzies out there, and that's the advantage of being able to put that little knife cut. It eliminates those fuzzies. Now I'll flip this over and do the same thing to the other side. At this point we have a choice, and I'm choosing to use a rasp to round over the tenon to match the mortise that's in my uprights. So you have a choice. I could either take a chisel and square off the ends of that mortise and leave this square, or use this technique and use the rasp to round over the tenons. And this is a method that I choose. Now that little scrap piece that I had to begin with as my test, I used that also to make sure that it's going to work just perfect. Bed rails, cut to length, and my table's not long enough. Had to make an adjustment. The last step in the processing of these rails is to round over this edge on all 4 sides. So that is the next step that I'll be doing now. And I have a 3/8 inch round over bit that will round over all of the edges. For this step, you really have a choice, and I'm choosing to use a 3/8 inch round over. You could also just as easily use a 1/2 inch round over. It's your choice on this. But this seems to work out real well, and at the router table, it'll make an easy job of being able to cut this round over, and you can see the results. That looks really, really good. So 3 more to go. To complete the bed rail component, I need to be able to have these boards to be able to support the mattress itself. Now these are 1.5 and by 1.5 square by the length of the bed rail. Pre-drilled all of the holes, countersinking it so that the screws will be definitely below the surface of this wood. I made this simple scrap wood jig to be able to eliminate the use of the tape measure. But now I can just put this onto my bed rail, slide my 1.5 by 1.5 inch member right up to where I need to have it, and then using 1 5/8 inch screw, screw it into position. Now let's move on to the making of the ladder. It's time to start working on the ladder, and I want to be able to have that where it's nice and rounded at the top and at the bottom. In this case, I'm using a coffee cup that will give me the perfect radius on those corners. Over at the bandsaw, I'll cut that shape to be able to ease off the corners on the top and bottom, and of course it'll be over to the sanders to make this nice and smooth. Once more, at the router table, I'm going to put a 1/4 inch round over on all of the surfaces. To make the ladder runs, I'm using a 1 inch dowel rod that will be cut to length, and I'm going to have 3 of those. I have my stop block in place to be able to cut all 3 of these exactly the same length. Again, this is a 1 inch dowel rod that will be slipping into a 1 inch hole on my ladder. To make this barrel nut work, you have to have a hole drilled right here that will go down into this area, and then this screw will have another hole that it will slide into to be able to tighten. Now I'm putting this screw halfway in between. So this is 115 millimeters, half of that is 57.5. Now based on this screw and the thickness of the upright on the bed, I have this set from right here at the shoulder back 1 3/8 of an inch. So this is the 115 millimeters, so at 57.5 would be right there. And I can mark that one, and I can mark it right here. And that gives me the center of that hole. And this particular barrel nut that I have, this particular barrel nut is 10 millimeters in diameter. And I have the 10 millimeter bit installed in the drill. Then I used a little scrap wood piece of block to be able to make sure that I'm completely perpendicular to be able to drill this hole. I'm using the tape that's on the drill bit to be able to control the depth. One of the things that I like better than having the tape on the drill bit is to have a stop collar. Unfortunately, I don't have a stop collar that was large enough, so the tape on the drill bit was the way to go. And in the end, that worked out quite nicely. Drilling all these holes is always a lot of fun because if you mess up, you have to start all over and you have to make a brand new bed rail. That's something I really didn't want to do. So the pressure's on. I had to make sure that everything was drilled exactly the way it needed to be the first time with no mistakes. So just take your time, drill very carefully, and make sure that these holes line up with the hole that you did for the barrel nut itself. I always like testing this at this point just to make sure, because there needs to be an adjustment. Now is the time to do it. So I drop in the barrel nut, slide in the screw, test it, and it worked out absolutely perfect. So it's far better to test now than when it's on the bed. On the bed upright, I had to drill the hole also. Now this hole is 3/4 of an inch, and this was the size of the washer that I had. And then it's recessed down so that when you put the bolt in, it's below the surface. To install the ladder, I had to use a little bit of creativity to be able to put this exactly where I wanted it because I'm working by myself. So that little scrap piece of wood at the bottom kept it from falling off. I could move it left and right and get the alignment exactly where I want it. Now putting the ladder about 3 inches off of the end post, and I'm using a scrap piece of wood again that's 3 inches to be able to have my alignment correct. With the ladder clamped in place, I now do all the layout for the different screws because this ladder will need to be attached. Alignment is critical, so once I have all of the measurements done, I can pre-drill the holes through the bed rail into the ladder, and that will ensure that I have perfect alignment when I put in the threaded inserts. Using the machine screws and the threaded inserts to assemble this bed makes it so easy should the time arise where you have to take it apart and move it. To secure this ladder to the bed rails, I'm using a 5/16 inch threaded insert, which is larger than my 1/4 and this will be able to secure it. I'm going to put 4 of them in, 2 at the bottom, 2 at the top, and I'm going to use the exact same method. I'm just threading this onto the 5/16 inch screw, just like that. Tighten these 2 nuts down. Just tighten it just a little bit, and I'm ready to be able to insert this. I need to tighten this top nut just a little bit more. And that screws directly in. I can keep my vertical aligned, and that looks real good. And I'll repeat this process now for the other 3. Now the hole that I drilled was a 25/64, and that makes it perfect for this insert. It's time to install the ladder, and with all the threaded inserts installed, and to make it easier, I took all the machine screws and washers and put those into the holes to begin with. That way, with me holding the ladder in place, I can just slip it through and screw that into the threaded insert. Once all 4 are in place with the loose fit, then I'll come back with the screwdriver, tighten everything up, and the ladder will be installed. Taking a look from the back side, you can see where I had pre-drilled the holes, countersink it so that this machine screw will be below the surface. So that way I don't have to worry about the mattress rubbing on this screw and being damaged. Now I need one last piece that will go right in here. And what this will do is support these 3 slats, because if you have to move this and you unscrew it from the ladder, these pieces will have no support at all. So I'm going to have one piece that'll come down to here and screw in to this bed rail also. And that will provide a lot more stability for this area. And of course I'll do the same thing on the other side of the bed. I'm taking a leftover piece of the 2x4, cutting it 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. And this length actually turned out to be perfect, so there was no additional cutting required on that. Here's a close-up look at the 1.5 by 1.5 inch blocks. The next step, I do want to be able to put a radius on each end of these, and to do that I'm just using the paint can to be able to create the radius that I want to have on each end of these boards. Then it's off to the bandsaw to be able to make the cut, and then over to the sander to to be able to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. Then it's back to the router table. At this point, I want to take a 1/4 inch round over bit and smooth off all of the edges. And that only takes just a couple minutes to be able to do, and then it's on to painting. Painting's always fun because it's the last step before it gets installed onto the bed. Well, with the paint all dry now, it's time to install this. I measured and I'm going to put this directly into the middle of this slat. I have it plumb. I'm clamping it in place, and then I can actually measure and drill the holes. I'm using an 1 1/4 inch screw to be able to secure this brace to these slats. Now this will be permanently attached. There's no need for this to come off. So once I have all 3 of these screwed on, then I'm going to concentrate on the threaded insert at the bottom on the bed slat itself. I'm placing these screws in the exact center of these slats. I'm pre-drilling it, and then I'm drilling to be able to allow for the countersink so that it will be flush with the surface. I don't want the screw to be sticking above the surface of the wood at all. And then I can secure that, and that will complete the 3rd screw. At the bottom, on the bed rail itself, I'm pre-drilling this exactly where it needs to be, and I'm measuring 1 inch down from the top of the bed rail. With that pilot hole in place, I can now take my drill bit and drill for the threaded insert. Now I'm using the exact same process that I've used throughout this project to install these threaded inserts. And I found that this method works extremely well and is pretty much foolproof. Once that hole is drilled, then I'll just take the threaded insert, screw it on to one of the machine screws. The 2 lock nuts there hold it in place. Now this is important to make sure that that threaded insert is screwed in straight. If it goes in crooked, it's not going to function properly, and it's going to give you a lot of problems when you're trying to use this. So that's why I use a long screw to be able to ensure that it stays vertical. Now I had to tighten that nut just a little bit tighter because it was slipping, but those 2 nuts act as a lock nut so that it will allow you to easily screw in that threaded insert into the wood. Once that's done, loosen that top nut, and then the screw can slip out. Now the pilot hole was already drilled earlier, so now it's time to drill the hole through this bed rail so that the machine screw can easily slip through and then screw into the threaded insert. And now for the fun part. It's time to install this brace, and I'm going to put the threaded insert and that screw in first, and then I can put those 1 1/4 inch wood screws in second. And because they are already in once, it makes it very easy to be able to keep the alignment correct to be able to install those screws. So this has been a very fun project to be able to do. I think the granddaughter is going to absolutely love the bed. She quite frankly has already tried it out and climbed all over it and is very excited to be able to have this bed in her room. I'm actually setting this up so that she has a little play area on the top bunk, and she'll be able to sleep on the bottom bunk. So now that I have the bed completely assembled, the next step is to take it all apart so we can transport it over to her house and set it up again in her room. I know she's excited and can't wait. I know it's going to be a lot of fun for me to be able to see her playing in this bed. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you will give me a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel, because this project has been an awful lot of fun to do, and I appreciate each and every one of you watching and enjoying this channel. And I hope this was an exciting project for you to follow along with, and I hope that you would consider taking on this challenge and building a bunk bed should you need one. So for now, bye-bye.